Taking an in-focus look at the fundamental Jefferson curl here, we have two variations. One of the variations features a halfway pause, and the other variation is the full Jefferson curl going through the eccentric and of course the eccentric. The Jefferson curl is essentially a strength and a mobility development tool which will progress the depth of your front folding pike over time, as well as certain prehabilitative aspects for the spine as well, related to spinal stability and also familiarity with the full range of the spine in a flexed position. What is essentially happening through this movement is that we're going through a sequential destacking and restacking of each of the vertebrae. So starting from a standing position, as you'll see, we're starting with the head. The cervical spine collapses or destacks and is followed sequentially by the rest of the spine, going through thoracic and then lumbar, and then also taking some range from the posterior chain of the glutes, hamstrings, calves, etc. as we descend into the bottom position, and of course reversing the movement exactly to then elicit a restacking of the spine on the way up. And we're not quite literally destacking and restacking vertebrae, but this is a nice and useful visualization. Taking this visualization, it then allows us to review our form by taking a video and also checking where there are certain aspects of the spine that are not flexing as much as others, or essentially not moving as much as others. So as an example, what can commonly happen is that we find there is a lot of movement in the thoracic spine, and then when we come lower towards the lower thoracic and into the lumbar, it can tend to move as one block. So whereas we would ideally find a nice rounded spinal position here, quite evenly rounded, it starts to be rounded in the thoracic, but the lumbar spine is straighter, like this. And this is also precisely what this movement is trying to allow us to work with, to notice where there is tension in certain parts of the spine being held, and quite commonly this is in the lower part of the back or the mid-back, for a variety of reasons. For example, sitting on it all day can contribute to this, but also, for example, performing a lot of weighted hinging contexts in which this neutral spine position is really encouraged. For example, in a deadlift or a Romanian deadlift, and I'm working in this position, we are perhaps not so used to releasing that tension and allowing the spine to naturally curve. The other reason that there can be blockages in there is perhaps there are some micro injuries or more severe issues that might be hiding there, so to speak, that our nervous system is protecting or perhaps overprotecting, meaning it might be something quite superficial, and the Jefferson curl can really help with mobilizing that area and improving any underlying issues. But it also might be something quite significant. Perhaps there is an anterior disc herniation. I mean, the majority of people, if we were to look and believe statistics, note that perhaps 80-90% of people have existing herniations in their spine. It just doesn't cause any issues or problems. But when we start exploring movement, of course, and the potentials and possibilities and what is and is not available, sometimes these things can come out. So that's another thing to note, is that the Jefferson curl could potentially be the best movement for your spine and developing your mobility ranges in front folding flexion. And it could be the worst thing that you could possibly do for your back at this point in time. And this depends on what is existing. As you know, Yoda said of the dark side cave in The Empire Strikes Back. What is in the cave, what is in this context, it is not innately evil or innately bad or will innately damage you. It all depends on what you take with you. What do you take with you into this cave? So Luke Skywalker says, Yoda, what's in the cave? And Yoda replies, only what you take with you. Okay, so it's this idea as well. If you find something, just be mindful of it. Review, for example, if it then gives you pain, a sustaining pain, that you know perhaps this movement is not for you at this time. consult other movements that do help you explore this area, maybe something as simple as decompressive hanging protocols or certain spinal mobilizations that are more open chain, for example, that will allow you to explore these areas. But the Jefferson curl as a mobility development tool for front folding is extremely potent, extremely powerful, extremely effective and progressive. With regards to weight, I advise you, unless you know you have an existing something hiding in your back, to start with something that's around 10 kilograms if you feel comfortable to do so. The reason is that when the weight is too light, for example 2 kilograms, 5 kilograms, it does not provide that load in order for us to work with this gradual rounding of the spine. In all these types of loaded progressive mobility contexts, whether it's pancake or whether it's a split hole with a weight, the weight is essentially facilitating the depth and also the load and the amount to which we can round or bring ourselves into deeper ranges that we would not be able to do without the weight. So the weight does have to be something that is sufficient for the particular context. And with regards to moving upwards with the weight, of course it depends on person to person. However, generally working up to a weight of 15 to 20 kilograms as a standard procedure is absolutely fine. If we're working with more slower isometric holding contexts. If we then look more into the strength development aspect, in which we're kind of bringing the reps down to 5 or 6 or even lower and increasing the weight, we threw around the idea of a bodyweight Jefferson curl. This is not necessarily something you have to put on your benchmark list, but it does exist that we can work with Jefferson curls for 50, 75 or 100% body weight. Of course, not so much with isometric holds, but more repetitions, working with that idea of the rounding of the spine and developing strength through that rounded range as well. So let's move on to the context itself. One thing to note is that we're using a box here. What can also be very, very nice is using, for example, a bench, if the bench is quite sturdy. And one of the reasons it's nice to use a bench is that when you come past the toes with the Jefferson curl, if you have the range, it can also be nice to bring the bar underneath the feet. This allows us to get more of a pure front folding context with a direct load underneath the foot. When you're working with a box, you're somewhat blocked against the box and it actually takes some of the load away. Whereas with a bench, you can bring it around the head of the bench and slightly underneath. The disadvantage is that a bench is normally quite soft, and so this is not always the best scenario, so you choose what would be best for you. In all cases, with the Jefferson curl, we will always set up with the feet together. The feet must be together, and they are located with the toes at the end of the box. And I advise this to be performed without shoes, always, because shoes will interfere with the mechanics of it. If your heel is slightly thicker than the cushioning at the ball of the foot, or if it has a lot of cushioning, this will disrupt the angle that you're working at. Also with regards to using, for example, a slant board to affect more calf mobility development, I would personally work calf mobility development in different contexts, specialise to that if that's an issue, and just focus on the Jefferson curl as the Jefferson curl with working with the spine. Normally that's enough to think about in the initial instance. Feet are together, toes are just on the edge here. I don't have them too far back. Again, if it's too far back, then I'm holding the bar against the box. It takes away some of the load, not as effective. If my toes are hanging over the edge, then the Achilles tendon and then the accompanying connective tissue comes under the foot and runs through to the big toe as well. So we do want to keep that there to be involved in the movement and not giving it not letting it relax over the edge, so to speak. So feet together, toes right by the edge, knees locked throughout. I take the bar in a shoulder width grip. Now, it is possible to also use a dumbbell or a kettlebell.
But what I will just say is that a barbell will allow you to start in a nice neutral position. And neutral for these purposes, we're going to keep the glutes tight, knees locked, stomach tight as well. So it's quite a rigid position. And the shoulders are just slightly back. I'm not retracted, I'm not hyperextended, they're just slightly pulled back and then down into the pockets. I am pulled upwards through the head top, nice and straight here. Now, if I'm working with a single anchor on a dumbbell or a kettlebell, what happens to my shoulders? I start necessarily in a more protracted position. I can try and bring it back more straight, but it's just not natural. The reason that I like to start nice and straight here is because it can emphasize the patterning of the cervical flexion, so the flexion of the neck and going into the upper back. It means that from here with shoulders back, I can start by tucking the chin, rounding the shoulders forward, and now this gives me access to the cervical spine. Of course, if you have to use a kettlebell, this is absolutely fine, but that aspect might just be missing because you're already in protraction. So you'll just have to round and then work straight to the back. You won't have this whole feeling of protracting and flexing the upper spine. One of the most significant and important details of the Jefferson curl is that it is not a hinging in the hip. It is not a hinging in the hip. And as I mentioned, if you are used to working with a hinging pattern, it will be quite significantly a practice of developing a new movement pattern and motor control over these particular areas, because it will be ingrained in you that when you bring a weight forward, you hinge to keep your back nice and stable in a neutral spine position, but that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for a rounding of the spine gradually. So what I will do, I will keep my glutes tight all the way until the halfway point at which my spine is fully rounded. And this will actually constitute the first variation of the Jefferson curl, which is with a halfway pause. The reason for the halfway pause is that it really allows us to practice this idea of keeping the hips quote-unquote open, but really it's just not hinging, but open, whilst having the maximal rounding of the spine elicited from the weight pulling us down. So instead of working here, gradually rounding, and then I've just broken the hips. I broke there already. Here it's broken. Whereas it should be here, and it's the spine coming down. Even now, I don't hinge. Don't hinge. Keep it tight. I keep the head tucked. And now for me now, if I keep the glutes tight, this is the halfway point. And you can see now, as much as I can express, I have this rounding of the spine, as opposed to if my hip was hinged, it would look like this. As you can see in the back here, and it's just hinged. But we're looking for tight glutes here. That's my halfway pause. Halfway pause I would hold here, the knees completely locked, even squeeze the quadriceps if you need to. And then from here, now I can release the glutes and then pull my head between the shoulders and lead with the top of the head towards the floor. I ensure that I'm not leading with the face. I keep the head in and I pull towards the floor. And if your range is only here, absolutely fine, even better. It means you can do it from the floor and you can really judge your progress over time. The reverse is going to be exactly the same. So I squeeze the glutes now. Now here's a nice tip for the way up. Turn the feet out as if I'm externally rotating them, screwing the feet against the floor. It will squeeze the glutes on, tighten the abdominals, and it will really help to stabilize and initiate the pull all the way from the bottom of the posterior chain. So starting with the feet. So from here, I squeeze those feet, I squeeze the glutes now. You can see my glutes turn. Look, maybe not, but it'll turn on, and now I tighten the stomach. Now I can come back. Now I'm back to my halfway position, and as I gradually go up the spine, the bar comes closer to my body.
Shoulders back.
Back to the starting position.
Also avoid, as you come up, this shrugging position. It's not a shrug. We're working with the spine alone. So from here, just bring the shoulders back to the start position, and then we move in again. So a full repetition. Tight glutes, tight abdominals. From here, tuck the chin. Shoulders, cervical spine, tight glutes, no hinging. Thoracic spine, no hinging. Lumbar spine, no hinging. Now, if there is a hold program, I will hold here. If not, I will pass through, break the hips. I ensure that the knees don't flex. It's very common that the knees will start to flex here because it allows you to go lower. But again, this is completely contrary to what we're developing, posterior chain mobility. So lock the knees, come as low as possible, wherever it is. Hold the bottom position, and then screw the feet out, tight the glutes, tight the abdominals, the bar in, coming through the lumbar spine, up to the thoracic spine,
Cervical spine. And then I finish my rep. If it was a straight rep, so with no pause, it would look like this.
Down through the spine. Now unlocking the hips, all the way down, pulling back in, glutes on, abdominals tight, working with the spine, all the way
to the top. And that was my repetition. Some other things to take into account with the Jefferson curl is that in the beginning, I personally advise working with a lot of isometric holds just to develop the range first of all. As I mentioned, this can develop into quite the strength movement, moving up to body weight, should that be desirable for the practitioner. However, in the initial instance, working, as I mentioned, with those halfway pauses for 5 seconds or so to mark that halfway position, and also isometric holds in the bottom. And we'll also move up to isometric holds, for example, for 30 seconds in the bottom position. Quite significantly, or specifically, I should say, looking towards that idea of developing the range, so essentially spending time there. At the same time, we cannot overlook that this is also a strength development context, with that idea of having strength with a rounded spine. So, for example, whilst the neutral spine mechanic is the best mechanic for lifting a heavy weight off the floor, there are many certain instances in life in which you simply cannot lift a heavy weight with a straight back. So in the context of strongman, as an example, an atlas stone. If I'm taking a big stone, an atlas stone here, there's no way that I can hold this stone here and bring it up and just keep a neutral spine, because I need to wrap myself around this huge ball and bring it up. And perhaps you're not lifting atlas stones, but as another example, when we are only used to certain pulling mechanics that are quote-unquote optimal, so a certain spinal position, what happens is that we simply don't have a pulling mechanic for when the back is in more of a rounded position. So the common idea is having the ability to lift quite a significant amount of weight off the floor, perhaps 2.5 times or even 3 times body weight in the context, a control context such as the deadlift. But then taking the young child out of the car, twisting to the side, bending to get your child here, and you pull them out of the car, and something interesting, not necessarily positive, can happen in the spine, because it's just a pulling mechanic that hasn't been explored. The body is used to having, okay, I'm doing a pulling pattern, there must be a certain amount of tension to stabilize the spine, and it just doesn't have familiarity or have a mechanism or a pattern to work with this movement. So that is also quite important to consider when we start increasing weight in that context as well. And with regards to weight and how much you use, there will be a couple of things that will determine it. Of course, the context. What are the variables? If it's like 10 repetitions and each repetition has a 10-second hold at the bottom and the last repetition has a 30-second hold, so you're looking at 2-3 minutes for one set, then perhaps you can't use a significantly heavy weight, and you would focus more on really pulling into that deep position,
getting the full range that you can, and also expressing every articulation of the vertebrae that's possible. Whereas if the reps are less, if it's just 6 straight reps, you're just going down and up, then perhaps you can explore if there's a possibility for a weight increase and how that feels when you're performing that with a heavier weight. The last thing to consider is that in the initial instance, you may find that because these sets can be quite extended because of it's not super quick going up and down, it's a very gradual tempo, and there are isometric holds as well, you may find that your grip strength might be lacking. Yeah, your grip strength might be lacking. That's just what you have to deal with, that's what you have to build. All I can recommend in the initial instance is using chalk on the hand, whether that's liquid chalk or whatever, that can help facilitate the grip. Another option that is possible to use if it's really, really necessary to pull off your set and not completely blow up your forearms or give yourself tendonitis from gripping too much for too long, you can also work with a switch grip. So that would mean that I'm working here with the grip like this and then coming down. This will help, of course, on the next step, making sure that you switch the grip. Of course, always the issue with this is that it slightly adjusts the posture. It doesn't have so much of an effect with the spine, but of course, the time with the lat is different, and also when we're pulling forward, it's causing more torque, so it does change it somewhat. So as much as possible, really try to work with the pronated grip unless there is really no other way. That is everything for the Jefferson curl in its 2 variations, with the halfway pause and also the full range flexion and extension in straight reps. Always be mindful when performing this movement. As I mentioned, it can be the best thing or the worst thing for you. Sometimes you might relax something or try to relax something that you shouldn't relax. Sometimes it just completely needed to be relaxed and you might get a little pop or a crack in the spine. But please do be mindful. Reflect on your execution, reflect on your, for example, the videos you record. If you notice that a part of your spine is quite straight, or if we're working together and I feed back and say this part of your spine is quite glued up, don't take it as, oh my god, my spine doesn't work. It's nothing to do with that. It simply means put your intention into that place. So for example, when I'm rounding and I know that here can get quite blocked, I will try to see, is there something that I can release? Can I release it a little bit more and affect that gradual unstacking of the spine? As with anything else, this is a context of practice, not just physiological, but also neurological in terms of building the movement pattern. But ultimately, as we're exploring new ranges, there are things and places that we will go to that are new. So just ensure that you approach them with sufficient sensitivity. But, as always, do go there.